The Forgotten Room. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. Oliver Gray was always drawn to the mysterious and the unknown. His curiosity was insatiable, the kind that propelled him into deep rabbit holes of old books, forgotten histories, and strange rumors. But nothing could have prepared him for the letter that arrived one cool autumn afternoon. The letter was from a law firm he had never heard of, tucked away in a small town in New England. It informed him of an inheritance, an old family mansion left to him by a great-uncle he had never met or even heard of. The details were vague, but the house, known as Gray Manor, had been in the family for generations. His great-uncle had lived there in complete isolation for decades before passing away. Curiosity piqued, Oliver made arrangements to visit the manor. The small town of Ashford was quaint, with cobblestone streets and Victorian-era homes. The townsfolk were polite but distant, their gazes lingering on Oliver with a mix of curiosity and caution as he made his way through the town. Gray Manor stood at the edge of a dense forest, its tall iron gates rusted and creaking as Oliver pushed them open. The house was a sprawling structure of dark stone, with ivy crawling up its walls and tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch his every move. The air around it was thick with a sense of foreboding. As Oliver stepped inside, the musty smell of old wood and dampness greeted him. The interior was just as imposing as the exterior, high ceilings, dark wooden paneling, and an overwhelming silence that made his footsteps echo eerily through the empty halls. He explored the house cautiously, his steps measured as he moved from room to room. The furniture was covered in white sheets and dust clung to every surface. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, untouched for years. But it wasn't the grandeur of the mansion that intrigued him. It was the subtle details that began to catch his eye. A door slightly ajar at the end of a long hallway, the faint sound of something scraping against the walls, the way certain rooms felt colder than others. As evening fell, Oliver found himself in what appeared to be the library. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with books of all sizes. A large, ornate fireplace dominated one wall, and above it hung a portrait of a stern-looking man, presumably his great-uncle. The man's eyes seemed to follow Oliver as he moved about the room. Oliver began to search through the shelves, running his fingers along the spines of the books, many of which were old and worn. He paused at a section of the wall where the books were unusually dusty, as if they hadn't been touched in years. As he pulled one of the books from the shelf, he heard a soft click. The bookshelf began to move, revealing a narrow, hidden staircase leading down into darkness. His heart raced as he peered down the stairs. A cold draft wafted up, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic like blood. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, Oliver descended into the darkness. The steps creaked beneath his weight, and the air grew colder the further he went. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, but unlike the library upstairs, these shelves held not books, but strange ancient artifacts. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, an old leather-bound journal. As Oliver picked up the journal, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. He could see his breath in the air, and a feeling of dread settled over him. The journal's cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, and the first thing he saw sent a chill down his spine. Scrawled across the first page in dark, spidery handwriting were the words, "Do not open the door." Oliver's hands trembled as he turned the page, eager to uncover the secrets hidden within the journal. But as he read, a noise from behind him made his blood run cold, a slow, deliberate creaking, like the sound of a door opening somewhere in the house. Chapter 2. The Journal. Oliver whipped around, his eyes scanning the dim room for any sign of movement. The creaking had stopped, leaving behind an unsettling silence. He listened intently, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. With the journal still clutched in his hands, he slowly ascended the stairs, each step echoing ominously in the confined space. The house above seemed different now, more oppressive, as if it were closing in around him. The once still air now felt charged with an unseen tension. Oliver returned to the library, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. He carefully placed the journal on a nearby table and began to leaf through its pages. The writing was erratic, the words scribbled in haste and fear. The entries were dated decades ago, and they told a story that chilled Oliver to the core. The journal belonged to his great-uncle, who had documented strange occurrences in the house. He wrote of the whispers that seemed to come from the walls, of objects moving on their own, and of a door, an ominous door that appeared in different parts of the house, only to vanish when approached. The door, he wrote, was not to be opened under any circumstances, for it was a gateway to something dark, something that should never be released. As Oliver read, the entries became more frantic, detailing his great-uncle's descent into madness. He wrote of sleepless nights, haunted by nightmares of the door and what lay beyond it. The final entry was the most disturbing. It spoke of the door appearing one last time, in a room hidden deep within the house. His great-uncle had sealed the room and hidden the key, vowing never to open it, but the journal ended abruptly with a final chilling sentence, "It wants to be found." Oliver felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He could hardly believe what he was reading, but the sense of dread that had settled over him was all too real. The journal slipped from his hands and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Suddenly, the silence of the house was shattered by the sound of a door slamming shut, followed by the unmistakable creak of floorboards as if someone, or something, was moving through the house. Oliver grabbed a nearby candlestick and moved cautiously through the halls, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. Every creak and groan of the old house made his heart race. He approached the door to the drawing room, the source of the noise, and hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, curtains billowing in the cold night air. A sense of unease washed over him as he crossed the room to close the window. He glanced out into the dark yard, but there was nothing, only the stillness of the night and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. He shut the window and turned to leave when something caught his eye. There, on the floor near the fireplace, was a small, ornate key. It glinted faintly in the candlelight as if beckoning him. Oliver knelt down and picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver through him. He knew without a doubt that this was the key mentioned in the journal, the key to the hidden room. Oliver's mind raced. Part of him wanted to leave the house, to run as far away as possible and never look back. But another part of him, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, urged him to stay, to uncover the truth about the door and what lay beyond it. With the key in hand, Oliver made his decision. He had to find the room, and he had to find it tonight. Chapter 3. The Hidden Room. Oliver moved quickly through the house, his pulse quickening with every step. The key felt heavy in his hand, as if it carried the weight of all the dark secrets buried within Gray Manor. The journal had mentioned that the hidden room was deep within the house, a place his great-uncle had sealed off to contain whatever malevolent force lurked there. But where? The mansion was vast, with countless rooms, corridors, and secret passages. As he walked, he tried to recall the layout of the house, piecing together clues from the journal and his brief exploration earlier. Then he remembered the one area he had avoided, the basement. The basement was a sprawling labyrinth beneath the mansion, a place so filled with shadows that even the bravest soul would hesitate to enter. Oliver had passed the door to the basement when he first arrived, noticing the thick iron bars across it, as though the house itself was trying to keep something locked away. Now, as he approached the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make a grave mistake. He hesitated only for a moment before inserting the key into the lock. The key turned with an ominous click, and the bars slowly retracted with a grinding sound that echoed through the empty hall. With a deep breath, Oliver pulled the door open. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, and it carried with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Oliver descended the stone steps, the darkness closing in around him. He held the candle high, its flickering light revealing stone walls lined with shelves, old tools, and crates covered in cobwebs. The basement seemed to go on forever, its corridors winding and twisting in all directions. As he moved deeper into the basement, Oliver began to notice a change in the atmosphere. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. It was as if he were entering another realm, one where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. The sound of his footsteps echoed strangely, distorted by the oppressive silence that surrounded him. Finally, he reached the end of the corridor where a large iron door loomed before him. Unlike the other doors in the basement, this one was heavy, with thick iron bands and strange, indecipherable symbols etched into its surface. The keyhole was large, and the lock looked ancient, as though it hadn't been opened in centuries. Oliver knew this was it, the hidden room. His hand trembled as he inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, he considered turning back, leaving the house and never returning. But his curiosity, and the growing sense of dread, drove him forward. The key turned with a loud clank, and the door swung open with a groan, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. Oliver stepped inside, his candle casting long shadows on the walls. The room was empty, save for a single object in the center, a large, ornate mirror. The mirror was unlike anything Oliver had ever seen. It was tall, nearly reaching the ceiling, and its frame was made of twisted, blackened wood that seemed to writhe and pulse as if it were alive. The surface of the mirror was dark, reflecting nothing but shadows. As Oliver approached the mirror, the temperature in the room dropped further, and he could see his breath in the air. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though he were standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into the void. The mirror seemed to call to him, pulling him closer with an invisible force. He reached out to touch the surface, but before his fingers could make contact, the mirror began to change. The shadows within it swirled and shifted, forming shapes and patterns that made Oliver's skin crawl. And then, slowly, an image began to take shape, a face pale and twisted with a look of pure malevolence, staring back at him from the depths of the mirror. Oliver recoiled in horror, stumbling backward. The face in the mirror grinned, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. It was then that Oliver realized the truth. The mirror was not just a reflection, but a window, a portal to something dark and terrible that had been sealed away in this room for centuries. The face in the mirror began to speak, its voice a low, guttural whisper that filled the room. "You have opened the door," it hissed. "You have freed me." Oliver's heart raced as the shadows in the room began to move, creeping toward him like living things. The mirror's surface rippled, and the face within it seemed to press against the glass, trying to break free. He had to get out, now. Oliver turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the dark corridors of the basement. But as he reached the stairs, he heard a loud crash behind him, followed by the sound of shattering glass. The mirror had broken, and whatever was inside it was now free. Oliver burst through the basement door, slamming it shut behind him. He locked it and bolted up the stairs, his mind racing. He had unleashed something terrible, something that had been imprisoned in that room for a reason. As he reached the main hall, the house seemed to shudder, the walls creaking as if the very structure was coming alive. Shadows danced on the walls, and Oliver could feel the presence of something following him, something that had escaped from the mirror. Chapter 4. The Haunting. The mansion had changed. As Oliver raced through the halls, he realized that the house was no longer the place he had first entered. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows darker, more oppressive. The once grand and silent rooms now echoed with faint whispers, and the air was thick with an unseen malevolence. Every corner Oliver turned, he could feel it, the presence that had been unleashed from the mirror. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, a cold, suffocating force that filled the house. He could hear it moving through the walls, the floors, even the air itself, a low hissing sound that made his skin crawl. Oliver needed to find a way out, but the house had become a labyrinth. The corridors twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, leading him back to the same rooms over and over again. It was as if the house was alive, shifting and changing to keep him trapped inside. Desperation gnawed at him as he tried door after door, only to find them locked or leading to rooms that seemed to have no exits. The windows were sealed shut, the glass cold and unyielding. The mansion had become his prison, and the shadows were closing in. As he made his way down a long, narrow hallway, Oliver heard a familiar sound, a slow, deliberate creaking. It was the sound of a door opening, but this time, it wasn't one he could see. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house, a door that was not bound by the physical limits of the mansion. The hissing grew louder, and Oliver knew that whatever had been released was coming for him. Panic surged through him, and he ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. He turned a corner and found himself in front of a large, ornate door, one he hadn't seen before. Without thinking, Oliver pushed the door open and stumbled inside. The room was dark, lit only by a faint, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes following him as he moved. In the center of the room was a large, circular table with a single chair. But what caught his attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was identical to the one he had seen in the basement, but this one was intact. The surface was smooth, reflecting the dim light of the room, but there was something different about it. Something wrong. As he approached the mirror, Oliver felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. He turned back to the mirror and his breath caught in his throat. The face was there again, grinning at him from the depths of the glass. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, Oliver could see shadows moving, twisting and writhing like living things. They were coming through the mirror, slipping into the room with him. Oliver backed away, but the shadows followed, their hissing filling the air. The door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The temperature dropped, and the walls seemed to close in, the portraits warping and distorting as the shadows filled the room. He had to do something, anything to stop the shadows from consuming him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. Only the mirror, the grinning face, and the encroaching darkness. In a desperate act, Oliver grabbed the chair and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and the shadows recoiled, shrieking as they were sucked back into the void. For a moment, the room was silent, the air still. But then, the walls began to tremble, and the house groaned as if in pain. The shattered mirror's frame twisted, the wood splintering as the dark forces within it fought to break free. The shadows were not gone. They were merely contained, and they would not stay that way for long. Oliver knew he couldn't stay in the room. He needed to escape the house before it was too late. He turned to the door, but it was gone, replaced by a solid wall. The house was sealing him in, determined to keep him trapped. The shadows surged again, more forceful this time, and Oliver felt the air grow colder. Chapter 5. The Escape. The cold pressed against Oliver like a vice, constricting his breath and numbing his limbs. The room seemed to shrink as the shadows encroached, their dark tendrils reaching out, eager to claim him. Panic surged through him, a primal instinct to survive driving him to action. He had to escape, and he had to do it now. His eyes darted around the room, desperate for any sign of an exit. The wall where the door had been was solid, unyielding. The windows were gone, swallowed by the darkness. The only source of light came from the flickering remains of the shattered mirror, its shards reflecting the twisted, grinning face that had haunted him from the beginning. Oliver felt the weight of the shadows bearing down on him, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. They wanted him, body and soul. In a sudden burst of clarity, Oliver remembered the journal. The journal had mentioned something, an incantation, a ritual that could banish the entity. His great-uncle had tried to seal it away, but in his madness, he had failed to complete the process. Perhaps, Oliver thought, there was still a way to finish what his great-uncle had started. But the journal was in the library and he was trapped here with no way out. Or was he? The thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. The mirror. It was a portal, a gateway between this world and the dark realm beyond. If the shadows could come through, perhaps he could escape the same way. It was a reckless idea, but it was the only one he had. Oliver approached the shattered mirror cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The shards on the floor seemed to pulse with a dark energy, but the frame, twisted and splintered as it was, still held a faint glimmer of power. He reached out, placing his hand on the largest shard still embedded in the frame. The moment his skin made contact, a shock wave of cold surged through him, as if the very essence of the void was trying to pull him in. He gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to pull away. He had to do this or he would be lost to the shadows forever. Focusing all his will, Oliver closed his eyes and whispered the words he remembered from the journal, words that his great-uncle had scrawled in desperation. The language was ancient, the syllables harsh and grating in his mouth, but as he spoke, he could feel the air around him shift. The shadows recoiled, hissing angrily as the room trembled. The mirror's shards glowed faintly, the light growing stronger with each word he spoke. The twisted face in the glass snarled, its eyes burning with hatred, but it was no longer grinning, was afraid. Oliver felt the power building, the portal opening wider, but he was also aware that the barrier between worlds was weakening. If he didn't act quickly, the shadows would break through completely, and he would be trapped in their dark realm forever. With a final, desperate push, Oliver thrust himself toward the mirror, letting the dark energy pull him in. For a moment, the world went black, and he felt as though he were falling through an endless void. The whispers of the shadows surrounded him, angry and confused, but he held on to the words of the incantation, repeating them over and over in his mind. And then, suddenly he was through. The cold vanished, replaced by warmth and light. Oliver found himself lying on the floor of the library, the journal clutched in his hands. The room was quiet, the air still. The shadows were gone. He was alive. But as he pushed himself to his feet, Oliver knew that he couldn't rest. The mansion was still tainted, still connected to the dark forces he had barely escaped. He had to finish what his great-uncle had started. He had to destroy the mirror completely, sever the connection between worlds, and ensure that the shadows could never return. Oliver rushed back to the basement, the iron door swinging open at his touch. The mirror was still there, but it was cracked and dull, its power weakened. Without hesitation, he grabbed the largest shard and drove it into the heart of the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The ground shook as the dark energy exploded outward, a final desperate cry of the shadows as they were sucked back into the void. The mirror's frame collapsed, crumbling into dust, and the room was filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, Oliver stood alone in the empty basement. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. The shadows were gone, banished back to the darkness where they belonged. He had done it. The house was free. But as Oliver made his way back up the stairs, the journal still clutched in his hands, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The mansion was quiet now, eerily so. The once creaking floors were silent, and the oppressive weight that had filled the air was lifted. Yet, deep within, Oliver knew that the house had not forgotten. It never would. The secrets of Gray Manor were buried now, but they would always linger, waiting for the next person curious, or foolish, enough to unearth them. Oliver stepped out of the mansion and into the cool night air. The stars above were bright, the wind gentle. For the first time since he arrived, he felt at peace. He closed the heavy iron gates behind him and walked away, never looking back. But even as he left Gray Manor behind, Oliver knew that he would never truly escape the darkness that had touched him in that house. It would follow him, a shadow in his mind, a whisper in his dreams, a memory that would never fade. And somewhere deep within the ruins of the old mansion, a single shard of mirror lay hidden in the dust, waiting.